You're basically taking your money and you're putting 2/3 of it into a bucket, you're pouring petrol into that bucket, and you're lighting it on fire. Hey guys, Tom here from the Investing with Tom YouTube channel. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed today's video, hit like, hit subscribe, and that way you can see future videos as well. So the topic of today's video is share buybacks. I think share buybacks are quite prolific at the moment, and you hear the term thrown around all the time, but I think there's a lot of people out there that either just have no idea what share buybacks are, or they have a fundamental sort of misunderstanding of how they work, how they can potentially benefit shareholders, how they can potentially harm shareholders, and what's the best way to kind of think about how a company is going about their share buyback policy. So that's the topic of today's video. Let's get straight into it. So firstly, let's talk about what a share buyback is. A share buyback, as the name suggests, is literally a publicly traded company going out into the open market, into the stock market, and buying shares in themselves, repurchasing their own shares. And the impact that has on shareholders is that there are now less shares in circulation if a company keeps buying them back. So when a company buys those shares back, those shares are retired, they no longer exist essentially, and there are less common shares of that company outstanding. And the effect that has for remaining shareholders, typically over the long term, is if the fundamental value of the business remains unchanged. So if we use market cap to assess what that is, if we have the same market cap of a company, but we have a whole lot less shares because the company has repurchased those, then that means the per share value is going to go up to keep the market cap or the total value of the business the same. So that's essentially the impact for long-term shareholders, is that if done correctly, share buybacks can have a very positive impact on the per share price of your shareholding. Now, there are certainly ways that share buybacks can be done poorly, and they can actually be detrimental to the per share value of your stock over the long term. So I think that's something we should talk about. Before we get into that, the share buyback is essentially a little bit like a competitor to the dividend. So both are sort of methods of returning capital to shareholders, and like we're going to get into in this video, there are pros and cons of both. So one of the main pros to the share buyback versus the dividend, particularly in a country like the United States, not so much of an issue here in New Zealand and in Australia, because we have a dividend imputation credit system here in New Zealand where we don't pay tax essentially on dividends, or we get some tax credits on our dividends. And Australia has their franking system, which is quite similar. So in the US, those things don't exist, and it means that when a company pays the shareholder a dividend, there's a double taxation effect. So firstly, the company makes money, they pay tax on those profits. Those profits are then distributed to the owners through a dividend, and then each of the shareholders, when they receive a dividend, actually have to pay tax on that dividend again, because it is classed as sort of personal income at that point. So there's a double taxation impact. Like I say, we don't have that to really as larger an extent as in New Zealand and Australia, but in the US it's definitely a thing, and it's definitely an important consideration. And that is actually one of the reasons why share buybacks often are favored over dividends by a lot of shareholders. So with a share buyback, you can take those after-tax profits within the company, and you can actually put 100% of that money to work in buying back shares. You don't have to have shareholders pay a little bit of tax on that buyback money. Now, although that looks great on the surface, there is some tax considerations for the share buyback side of things as well. So the impact of higher taxation in the share buyback situation versus the dividend situation will happen when you actually sell your shares in the company. So when you sell shares in a company in the US, if you're a US citizen, you have to pay a typically a long-term capital gains tax rate on any profits you made while owning that stock, assuming that you held that position for more than a year. And what happens in that situation is you pay around 15%, which is the long-term capital gains tax rate. That is still much lower than the rates you're typically paying on dividend income. So it still works out a lot better, generally speaking, to have most of that money put into share buybacks rather than dividends from a tax point of view. But those are the considerations from the tax kind of angle. So that's what a share buyback is. Share buybacks and dividends are both ways of returning capital to shareholders, but they can be done well and they can be done poorly. So let's get into that. Now, if you can get the following analogy into your head around share buybacks, you will understand them inside out and probably never have to think too hard about them again. And that analogy basically is that when a company buys back its shares, it is buying out other shareholders. So if you take an example of a business that you might have some business partners in, it's basically you taking the profits from the company and purchasing the shareholding of your other shareholders to kind of buy them out, get them out of the business so that you own more of the overall pie. And if you think about it logically and think about it like that, that should give you a pretty good idea of whether or not a company's share buybacks make sense at a given share price. And an example I've used talking about this on the channel before is, let's take the example of a real estate syndicate, just because I think it is a really kind of simple example to get across. So let's say that there's a group of 5 of you, all in a real estate kind of group, and you've gone out, bought and developed a whole bunch of properties, and you now own this sort of portfolio of properties that are all rented out. And there comes a point in time where you want to buy out some of your shareholders, some of your existing shareholders are interested in selling, and let's say the total value of all of the rental properties that kind of syndicate owns is $10 million when the shareholders want to exit. So basically, if you can buy out that shareholder at anything less than a $10 million valuation, you can essentially instantly increase your equity and instantly make money on that transaction. So if you can buy out that shareholder for a valuation of $5 million instead of $10 million, every dollar that you're paying that person to purchase their shares, you're effectively doubling that instantly, because you're acquiring assets worth $10 million, but you're only paying $5 million for them. So same kind of thing happens on the flip side. So we can have situations where companies' share prices are inflated to ridiculous levels. And when they get to that point, if a company is constantly buying back shares, that can be quite detrimental to the long-term shareholder. So if we take that same real estate syndicate example, it's effectively like buying out the shareholder, which has a proportional interest in this $10 million of real estate. It's effectively like saying, hey, I'm going to pay you $20 or $30 million for that real estate and only get $10 million for it. And when you pay a $30 million sort of valuation for $10 million worth of intrinsic value, you're basically taking your money and you're putting 2/3 of it into a bucket, you're pouring petrol into that bucket, and you're lighting it on fire. And that effectively is share buybacks explained. If you can have a company management purchase back shares at below intrinsic value, phenomenal, great thing for long-term investors. If you can have them purchase back shares above intrinsic value, very bad thing for investors. And that is probably a situation where you may prefer the company to put more of that money that was initially intended for share buybacks into something like a dividend. Because although you're typically going to have to pay a higher tax rate on that dividend, you are not going to be taking that money out into the parking lot and burning it by overpaying for the assets that company owns. So those are some thoughts on share buybacks. Done well, they can do phenomenal things for investors. I'll put up some screenshots here of companies that are what Charlie Munger would call Uber cannibals and Monas Prabhai would call Uber cannibals, which are basically companies that are just eating themselves in terms of constantly funneling their own money into buying back their own shares. And these are examples of companies that have done it really well. I'll also put up a chart of a company that has done it quite poorly, which is someone like IBM, has been buying back shares for a long, long time. And effectively the per share value created by those share buyback programs is less than the cash that's actually been used to buy back those shares. So that's not what you want to see. Ideally, you want to put $1 to work and get more than $1 in intrinsic value or in market value long term from your share buybacks. But those are some examples of both, and that's the way I like to think about share buybacks in general. So just the final thing I want to touch on in this video is I guess how I like to hear management talk about share buybacks, because they're effectively the people that are going to put your money to work in terms of buying out other shareholders or not. So they're the people that are sort of making that decision. And effectively what I look for is pretty basic. So in a perfect world, I'd hear someone like talk in a similar language to Warren Buffett. So Warren Buffett talks about share buybacks quite often, actually, and he's basically authorized to buy back shares at anything less than, I think it's 1.3 times book value now. It was 1.2, now I think it's about 1.3. Might be wrong on that, but it's ballpark around that range. And effectively that means that, he understands very well that share buybacks can make a lot of sense, but you have to pay the right price. Compare that to a company like Apple. Apple has bought back a lot of shares, and for the most part I think it has been quite successful, but they use quite different language, and I think quite dangerous language in terms of their share buybacks. So, and they're certainly not the only company that does it. There's a lot of people that talk in this way when they're talking about share buybacks. And basically, in terms of saying, something along the lines of, we will buy opportunistically, we have up to this amount of money, available for share buybacks if the opportunity arises. If the price gets low enough, we'll put more of that money to work. If it doesn't, maybe we won't. Maybe we'll pay it as a dividend, or we'll just keep it in the bank or whatever. That's kind of the ideal way that you want to hear management talk about share buybacks. Unfortunately, what you hear in a lot of companies is they'll say something like this, in the next year, we plan to put $1 billion to work in buying back shares. And they simply won't even look at the price of the shares. They'll just say, oh, okay, we've only spent 500 million so far. We've still got 500 million to go. And even though the share price has doubled in the last, 3 months, we still want to put that extra 500 million to work and buy back those shares because that was our target. And I think just falling into that kind of mindset of, we have this much money, so let's spend it regardless of price, can be very dangerous for shareholders long term. So those are kind of things I look for in management. That's an overview of share buybacks, and that is how they can work very well, or they can work quite poorly. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit like, hit subscribe. You can watch some older videos over there. Hit subscribe over there, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.